Hi everybody, Sean Woodland inside the CrossFit Update Studios, being joined by General Manager of the CrossFit Games, Justin Berg. There is some big news out there regarding rookie Garard, the first podium finisher to test positive for banned substances at the CrossFit Games. Justin, thanks for stopping by. We're going to start at the beginning here and really just get the details out of the way so everybody's on the same page as far as how this all works. So how do we test athletes?
So CrossFit runs a combination of in-competition testing for our podium finishers as well as directed testing. The directed testing is for athletes in competition as well that may not be podium finishers, so they finish somewhere down the leaderboard. And we also run directed testing out of competition, meaning that there can be no notice test for the athletes in the off season or between open regionals or regionals and games.
Who's in charge of this?
So CrossFit has used drug-free sport for the last, I think, 6 years to administer the program. So they're responsible for the collection of all the samples around the world. And then we use the UCLA laboratory, who's also the same laboratory used by the United States Anti-Doping Agency and most other large agencies in the United States for the testing of the actual samples that we collect.
You mentioned this a little bit in one of your answers, but just to be clear, which athletes do we test?
Okay. So we start with all the podium finishers from the regionals and all the qualifying athletes who are moving on to the CrossFit Games on the individual side. So not just podium finishers, but all top 5. Okay. And then we also test additional athletes at regionals, so that are not qualifying to the games. Once athletes are at the games, we test all podium finishers, and then we have several tests throughout the course of the week for athletes who have not yet finished their competition, and that includes masters athletes, individuals, and teams.
You mentioned direct testing, and this was something that came up with the 5 Meridian athletes, and we're going to talk about them in a second. But what exactly is direct testing, and how do we employ it?
So direct testing is the opposite of random testing. So in random testing, you would select a pool of athletes, and you either have a collection agent or you have just a random lottery that says pick a uniform number, pick a letter, and then go test that athlete. We choose to use directed testing. I think it allows us to be better informed. Athletes that may tend to be closer to the top of the leaderboard, or athletes that there may be allegations or suspicion around. We're fortunate that the CrossFit community is very tight-knit, and so we get a lot of information both through our allegations channels and support at CrossFitGames.com, as well as a lot of the judges and administrators who are also at regionals. You know, they hear about where these athletes come from, and sometimes, you know, the rumor mill churns up a couple of positive leads.
Other than what happened with the Meridian athletes this year, has there been a case where we have used direct testing and we have actually caught somebody?
Yeah, well, we use directed testing a lot. Natalie Newhart a couple years ago was an athlete that we direct tested. We saw some unusual results, you know, and we tested her in the off season. I think that was around the time of the Open, and so she was a positive result. Richard Bolkin, I believe, was in the same case a couple years ago. He wasn't tested on a podium. He wasn't tested at a regional, but instead he was tested in the off season, and he was part of a pool, and we said, test him. You know, sometimes there's a reason that we test them. Sometimes we just go, you know, there's some speculation or, you know, other information that we choose to be, you know, let's try it out. Let's see if it's accurate.
Anyone who does test positive has a chance to appeal. What exactly does that entail?
So the appeal process begins with notification. And so if an athlete tests positive for a banned substance, they'll receive an email from us, and it will state the substance that was in their sample that we tested. And then we ask them that they, you know, submit a written appeal or a notice of reception of that email within 72 hours. Usually we ask that if they have a banned substance, that they also list any supplements or medication that they're taking. From time to time, athletes will be taking legitimately prescribed medicine, either through a doctor or a healthcare provider that's banned in competition. And so we ask them to list any medications and if they have any doctor's information along with that. And then also, importantly, the list of supplements that they're taking. Once they send that information to us, we'll review it, and then we will move forward with assessing a penalty. In Ricky's case this year, he also had requested an additional 10 days, which was the maximum amount of time that we would allow to gather himself and to create a formal written appeal. And so once that appeal process is done, we hear what they have to present and make a ruling on their case, both on you know, the length of penalty and just, you know, validating the fact that you know, they have no information that would refute the fact that they had that, you know, banned substance in their sample.
So Ricky gets an extra 10 days. What ultimately was his appeal?
So Ricky's appeal was, it followed a couple different tracks. The first was that he thought that maybe it was a mistake, and he had asked that his B sample be tested, which is a right that the athlete has. We tested his B sample during that 10-day period, and the B sample confirmed the same result, that there were 2 banned substances in his sample, both the A sample and the B sample. He also thought that maybe it was, he had done an improper amount of research, or maybe he mistakenly took one of those substances. But ultimately, athletes are responsible for what they put in their body, and we're very clear about that in our drug testing policy, and we've been very consistent with that over time, is that if you have a banned substance, you're guilty. And if there, for whatever reason, it was a tainted supplement, or if it was an intentional desire to cheat, it's the same result in our mind. We don't get to, we don't get to be subjective on that. It's an objective thing. You're on the wrong side of the line. That means you don't get to play.
Ricky Garard recently took to Instagram and offered somewhat of an explanation. What did you think of that?
I read it last night. From our perspective, from my perspective, I think that it's got to be a frustrating experience for an athlete to go through. To do as well as he did, and then find out that your results have been invalidated. I have a hard time believing that this is news to him. This is not a case like we've had others where it looks like immediately following our notification they go, but look, here's exactly what I was taking. I can't believe it. And we have this happen all the time. The most frequent cause of failed tests in our sport are masters athletes who think that they're taking a legally prescribed hormone replacement therapy, which is actually banned in competition, but they don't know, or that people are taking tainted supplements. And then as soon as this pops up, they Google the supplements that they're taking, and they go, oops, this has a banned substance that may not be labeled. His wasn't that case. And so this doesn't appear to be purely accidental. I thought what was frustrating is that he, at the middle of his response, says that he knows that there are other athletes that are outsmarting the system. And I think this is an opportunity for him as an athlete that if he has that information, he can share it with us, he can be part of a solution. But I think it's damaging to his other athletes, and I think that's what cheating does. It's not just ruining the leaderboard, but it's tarnishing the hard work and the talent and the dedication that your fellow competitors have. By going out like that, you're saying that I think a lot of other people are also. And it's dragging a lot of good athletes, good, clean athletes that are doing the right thing. It's sullying their reputation, and I think it's unfair to them.
We're going to get more into that in a quick second, but another thing I wanted to ask you about is, have we had an appeal that an athlete has made that has actually worked in his or her favor?
Yeah, it's very rare that an athlete appeals because really at that point it's mostly black and white. So at the time that you fail your drug test, you get a positive result back, you have that substance in your body. And it's very hard for you to say at that point, well, it really wasn't in my body, because we have a test through a credible lab and collected and handled appropriately that says you provided that sample and that sample contained that, which means it had to have come from your body. There have been a very small number of instances where for prescription drugs that are allowed in competition with a TUE, that athletes have been issued a retroactive TUE. It's pretty uncommon, to be honest. It doesn't mean that just because your doctor prescribed you, testosterone or an anabolic substance as part of a legal prescription, you don't get a retroactive TUE for that.
But what's a TUE?
A TUE is a therapeutic use exemption. Okay. And so some athletes, and this is what we encourage all athletes to do, is if you're taking any type of medication, is you notify us, you'll fill out a form called a therapeutic use exemption form, and you apply to have an exemption to be taking something. And sometimes in acute cases for certain drugs, or in chronic cases, for certain athletes, they can apply for that. And then based on the banned substances list from WADA, we go, okay, well, this is allowed as long as it's been declared in advance.
Ricky Garard was tested twice that we know of this season, after regionals, and then again at the games. So that's May and then in August. Why are we just hearing about this now?
The reason we're hearing about it now is there was nothing to report following regionals. So Ricky provided a sample following the Pacific Regional. That sample was tested, and it didn't show any adverse findings. At the CrossFit Games, he was tested again. The reason it's taken a little bit of time is, it takes several weeks for us to get all the samples tested. Once they're tested, we notify the athletes if there's been a positive result, and then Ricky began the appeal process. And so as part of that appeal process, we tested his B sample, and so it took a little bit longer to get back. And one of the things that we do is we allow the athlete to have, the opportunity to engage with us, through email and through the appeal process before we make this publicly known. And then as soon as we had notified him, very shortly after that, we notified him of his penalty, and we immediately published the results.
Anytime something like this happens on social media, there's this cry of, you should use USADA or WADA, WADA. Why does CrossFit not use those two organizations to test our athletes?
Yeah, so USADA is a great organization. They are one collection agent or one administrator of a drug testing program. The United States Anti-Doping Agency is a national doping agency. We have a global sport. We've had several conversations with USADA over the course of several years. Principally, they're founded to be the official testing agency for Olympic sports, and so they're organized in a different fashion. Drug-free sport seemed like a better fit for us. They have more experience, and they have a global network of testing professionals, doping control officers, that allowed us to be able to tailor a program that fit CrossFit and on our international needs, especially our international growth needs. We have more people participating outside the U.S. than ever before, and I think there's opportunities for more competition outside the United States, so it made sense for us to go with a global company first. And then also I think it's important to realize that they use a lot of the same facilities. USADA and Drug-Free Sport both use the same laboratory to test the specimens, or to test the samples that they collect. So really what you're doing when you hire an agency like that is, it's which collection agents are you using? And, it's important for us that we maintain some control in the process.
We had 5 athletes from the Meridian region that we had to penalize. We now get the news about Ricky Garard and these other 2 Masters athletes. Does CrossFit have a bigger banned substance problem than we think?
I think we have exactly what we have, which is that this year, we had 5 athletes from the Meridian. We had 3 additional athletes at regionals, and then we had 3 athletes at the CrossFit Games. Now, remember, we have had almost 300 tests this year. And so when you look at that, it is what it is. Do I think it's bigger or smaller? We can only respond to the facts that we have. I think there's a perception that we're trying to hide results. That's not the case. I think every year, just like the test of fitness evolves, and it evolves with the athletes, our drug testing policy evolves also. So it's not an off-the-shelf policy that is static and it remains the same. We, every year, have deployed more and more resources to out-of-competition directed testing, so unannounced testing. We implemented a registered athlete pool several years ago where we can collect whereabouts, which means that we can perform no-notice testing very quickly and with higher accuracy. We also have a policy that no athlete can fail a test without penalty, or can miss a test without penalty. And there's been a few instances where athletes either chose not to or were unable to cooperate with a collection agent, and the penalty for that was a mandatory 1-year suspension, which meant they couldn't continue with the rest of the season. And so, yeah.
There's a common thread that anytime, again, on social media, that we put this out, the immediate comments from a lot of people are, well, all CrossFit Games athletes are using, and if you think any differently, you're delusional. How would you respond to that? Yeah,
we don't. I mean, you can't respond. If your belief is that something is what it is, we're not in the business of trying to convince you. It's our job as a sport to go towards this problem, to deploy resources and staff and really try to go towards this problem. And if we think it's a growing problem, then we have a commensurate response. But we don't try to convince people that don't want to be convinced, or they saw a documentary and now they're an expert. I think what's important for us is communicating to the people that do matter, which are the athletes, that we're going towards this problem. And so you see athletes that test positive, we don't put our heads in the sand. We've never had an instance where an athlete tested positive and we hid that result or did not publish that result ever. And so I think it's important that they know that we take this very serious and that we're looking for their reputation the same way they are. So I think that there's lots of clean athletes that are doing the right thing and that are exceptionally gifted and talented athletes that we hold up and we shine the spotlight on. And this is another opportunity for them to validate their fitness. And the test would not be complete if you didn't have drug testing, because you have to validate that this is, performed on a fair and level playing field. You mentioned hiding tests, and I know there are people out there who are saying, yeah, sure, if one of your big names, one of your quote-unquote money makers ever tested positive, you'd protect them. How do you respond to that allegation? We've never done that, and I think it's a short-sighted argument. The worst thing for CrossFit is not that you have a top athlete that tests positive. The worst thing for CrossFit is that there's a controversy around trying to hide this kind of thing. Dave and I are of the exact same mind. We want to get this out into the public as soon as possible, respecting the athlete and their appeal process, but trying to get this out as quickly and transparently as possible. It wasn't CrossFit that did something wrong here. There was an athlete that was on the wrong side of the line. We haven't handled this incorrectly or inappropriately. We never have. In that sense, we've published every single instance that we've had. There have been some athletes that were cheating, or that they were using performance-enhancing drugs, or they weren't following the drug testing policy, and we've always published that. So the worst thing that could happen to our organization is that you are hiding something like that, and we're very respectful of that, and we don't do that because that's the most damaging thing that could happen. And so if people want to attack our integrity and say that we're hiding things, all I have to say is, we've published every single result, and there is nothing to hide, and that would be the worst thing.
And there is a segment of people who have just such a certain level of skepticism that they're not going to believe that, or whatever you say, they're still going to have this perception that everyone's dirty, everyone's cheating. What do you say to that person who has that level of skepticism that is just not going to buy any of this?
There's nothing you can say. I think our role in this, so my job's the general manager of the CrossFit Games, and so we have to make sure that we have a level playing field, that we consistently administer the competition around the open, around the regionals, around the games, not just for drug testing, but fairness in judging, fairness in sport. I think that we have a role to play in this. I think athletes in the community have a role to play also. I think that there are a lot of very qualified athletes who are upset about this, and I think that they have a role to play in the public discussion of whether or not this is a big problem or if it's an isolated incident. It's probably somewhere in the middle, but I think their perspective is something that we listen to. We have a good relationship with a lot of athletes. There's been a lot of people that use the allegations forum to tell us, hey, we think things are going wrong, this gym or this athlete, or I think there's suspicious behavior. We take that, and that's the benefit that the CrossFit community has, is this network is much stronger than just one group or one third-party agency trying to get out there. We leverage our community, and I think there's an appropriate role for athletes to play in, providing their perspective in this also. Good, bad, or, indifferent.
How does what happened this past season with the Meridian athletes and now with Ricky Garard, how does that affect how we are going to address this problem now moving forward?
Well, we always respond. And so I think what we've seen here is we made some changes to how we test at regionals, and we encountered more athletes with positive tests. So I think we'll learn that, and we'll adjust our testing for regionals next year. We will also adjust our testing directed out of competition. We take it very serious, and the claim Fittest On Earth is something that we defend, through the legitimacy of our programming, and our drug testing policy is right there also. So we will use this to, continue to smartly test people in the off season. We'll add some new athletes to the registered testing pool. We'll continue with directed testing and no notice testing as well. But we'll continue to see where the problems are and go towards those problems. You don't hide, you don't just do the same thing year after year, but it'll evolve.
Justin Berg, General Manager of the CrossFit Games. For all the latest on this issue and for continuing coverage of it, be sure to head to games.crossfit.com.